In the first breath of this tale, imagine a door sealed by faith and fear, a heavy oak that kept the sun from touching newborn skin. Beneath the street lamps and shipping smoke of Providence in 1762, a house smiled on Sundays and whispered at night. Its master, Deacon Ezra Rutherford, wore holiness like armor and suspicion like a map. He believed the world above had been tainted by coin and laughter, and he turned his love into a fortress. The basement. When I say that name, feel its grain under your palms, Rutherford. You are not merely listening, you are being invited into a ceremony of understanding, a slow unmasking of how devotion slips into domination. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. While you do that, make this secret public. Subscribe and tell us where you hear this, your town, in the comments. It is part of a ritual of witness. The house had shutters, a family pew, a man who moved congregations to tears. Yet beneath its beams, Ezra's piety curved inward, shaping plans like prayer notes gone wrong. Mercy, his wife, young and trusting, thought the candles below were an answer. Ezra thought they were refuge. When the first cries came, two in quick succession, the town paused as if to listen. Twins Samuel and Judith arrived into a place of contradictions, merchants blessing gains while trading in human suffering, the harbor bringing ideas that felt like temptation. Ezra did not announce their birth. He did not open his door to congratulations. He spoke of fragility, of long recovery, framing seclusion as mercy. What followed was a patient architecture of silence, alcoves for oil lamps, warmed floors, rugs softened with imported cloth, books chosen to shape soul more than mind. He called it a nursery, others would call it a cell. The difference between sanctuary and prison is often a turn of the key. The basement's thick walls muffled sound until music became a private liturgy below the floorboards, and so that first month passed with a holiness that felt like a slow, deep breath. Ezra read scriptures aloud each morning, his voice shaping routine into doctrine. He taught hymns before eyes could focus, convinced that melody could form character, and in that conviction the basement's air began to change. Stay silent. Days folded into a liturgy of small actions, dawn prayers, measured hymns, the washing of linen, the counting of breaths. Mercy believed this care was piety, a husband protecting his children. She watched Samuel and Judith sleep and trusted the rhythms Ezra set. But there was a quiet in Ezra's movement below ground that did not belong to gentleness. He marked stones with scratches, symbols that began like initials and grew into shapes mercy could not place. He filled a journal with theories about purity and containment, pages where prayer slid into procedure. Goodwife Prescott visited less often. Ezra declined public thanks and turned away gifts. Neighbors noticed drawn curtains and the family's absence from church suppers. Providence gossip is slow. Questions rose. Why were the twins kept from sun for weeks, then months? Ezra answered with scripture and calm authority, saying the world was a fever and innocence a sacred chalice. He framed seclusion as stewardship. Mercy had moments when the house felt too quiet, when lullabies seemed to come from the children's bellies at odd hours and their eyes, when they opened, tracked the room with a slow, strange attention. At night Ezra's whispers were not simply prayer but practice. He rehearsed words mercy could not follow, syllables bent toward command. He taught hymns that included archaic lines, phrases whispered by sailors on distant decks. The language had edges that made Mercy's scalp prickle. She asked where he found these words. He said salvation sometimes required new liturgies, and she swallowed fear like bitter medicine. The house pulsed with ritual. The twins grew beneath songs and careful feeding, limbs rounding, skin unmarked yet pale. Each measured kindness deepened the lock. Evenings carried a low duet through the floorboards, two voices answering each other in a chamber that sunlight had never touched. Ezra's journal became a manuscript of intent. He drew sigils that matched no church rubric and wrote marginalia about preserving original light through removal of sight. His notes argued that exposure to sunlight introduced ideas that gnawed at souls. Darkness, he claimed, was a crucible for purity. He used medical texts selectively, citing remedies that justified restraint. Dr. Hamilton's advice about limiting visitors was twisted into law. Soon Ezra controlled Mercy's movements, forbade visits, and shaped every candlestick in the house. The basement shifted from refuge into a controlled sanctuary and silence. Winter tightened Providence and the basement, warmed by oil and cunning, became the twins' world. Outside, sails were furled and merchants argued. Below, the Rutherford nursery measured months by ritual rather than calendar. Ezra kept a timetable: readings at dawn, measurement of sleep, the training of attention. He introduced contrast exercises, shadow play that taught Samuel and Judith to read motion without light. At first, Mercy believed these gentle trainings, but the children changed. Their pupils grew wide and slow, eyes learning to drink the dim until faces floated within black pools. Instinct became adaptation. They developed a hearing that multiplied. The creak of stone became a map, the drip of water a clock. Their speech matured in patterns Ezra reinforced, call and response hymns tying breath to the basement's heartbeat. The songs took on layers, embedded syllables answering one another like echoes. Visitors heard a muffled harmony. Those who eavesdropped close to the earth swore they heard phrases no congregant could recognize. Merchants said the twins sang under the world, and sailors, when sober, admitted to vows learned in distant ports. Ezra recorded each ability in his journals, noting sensitivity as proof of a sacred experiment's success. He tested limits: what happened when lamps were dimmed earlier, when voices fell. He assessed reaction like a physician. Mercy's role narrowed to caretaker and witness. She protested less as her pleadings were reframed in scriptural terms. Once, when she tried to lift a blind to let morning in, Ezra stopped her with a Bible and a calm voice that shook. He read verses about guarding innocence and whispered that the world outside would teach vanity. Mercy, exhausted and dutiful, let the blind fall. The twins learned preference for depth over distance. Objects lost detail but gained texture. Hands memorized the room's folds like a cartographer mapping coastlines. Some neighbors spoke differently. A baker's wife heard a hymn beneath the floorboards that unsettled her. A coachman swore a child's hand brushed his ankle on the stairs. Goodwife Prescott reduced visits to urgent checks and kept a small private notebook of odd details. Mercy grew thin from the weight of deciding what was faith and what was harm. The house held its breath. The twins learned a language darkness alone could teach. Occasionally, Ezra descended with items from his ships, things that smelled of far ports and whispered other people's names. Always. The basement grew deliberate in its alterations. Ezra bored shallow holes into stone and set glass lenses that caught lamplight and funneled it into corners, as if fitting the room for nocturnal observance. He carved an altar and inlaid scripts that looked like scripture until studied closely. Mercy watched him arrange these things and felt a cold recognition. The same hands that blessed the congregation placed tools of control in the child chamber. Ezra's theological notes hardened into ritual manuals, sequences of songs regulated sleep, and gradations of light intended to calibrate perception. He wrote a phrase he claimed came from an old prayer, but no scholar could match it to known liturgies. The pattern had the authority of custom, though it was new. He called it a restoration. Once a week he led the twins into an inner room and read aloud passages Mercy could not bear at the door, stories of light that burned the soul, of salvation demanding removal from the sun. He folded these stories into lessons, and the children learned obedience as piety. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Ezra's influence seeped outward. At the meeting house he delivered sermons of alarm and remedy. Some elders watched with unease, others welcomed guidance that eased private guilt. Mercy drifted between applause and pity. She noticed small thefts, sugar missing, candles moved, yet the household was so managed by Ezra's decrees that suspicion had little purchase. Servants accepted leaving rather than arguing with bars and schedules. A laborer refused work when he saw the basement door barred and the iron key in Ezra's pocket. A neighbor left a basket of fruit and a note. It sat for days, then vanished. Gossip and ordinary irritations did the work of masking the house's rot. Mercy confided in Goodwife Prescott, who noted troubling details but feared formal accusation. Prescott knew Ezra's standing would silence inquiry and feared peril that came with naming a respected man. A cautious neighbor spoke to a magistrate, yet Ezra's donations and reputation smoothed official curiosity. People preferred pious explanations to scandal, so concern folded inward, kept to whispers and careful glances, and the basement's gospel layered as sediment, each lesson harder to dislodge. All the while, The children hummed a hymn none could translate, and the house swallowed questions a mouth. Mercy kept her fear folded into the rituals until the fold unraveled. Her protestations began as small pivots, an insistence that the twins feel sunlight on cheeks once a week, a suggestion of fresh air. Ezra redirected each plea into scripture, into parables about seeds and purification, until Mercy's language became doctrine. She tried to enlist Goodwife Prescott in a plan to educate the twins above ground for an hour each Saturday, to mix their waking with the world's ordinances. Prescott hesitated at the border of daring. The midwife feared the legal consequences and the danger of angering a man who owned ships and influence. Still, she made a promise and arranged for a single hour, a careful experiment that could be explained to neighbors if asked. On the appointed morning, Mercy woke early, heart hammering, and reached for a shawl. Ezra checked the lamp, counted the hymns, and asked the reason for this sudden day. Mercy said it was for the children's health, but Ezra's face folded like parchment when she named the hour outside. He allowed the step as if granting a mercy, and Mercy led the twins by a narrow stair that smelled of coal and cedar. The first sliver of dawn struck the stair and touched Samuel's cheek. He did not cry. He opened his mouth, and the sound that came was not a child's gasp, but a muted chord that seemed to accept light the way one accepts a rare guest. Judith blinked slowly, unaccustomed to color. Mercy felt a wild joy, a small crack of sun in her life. Then Ezra's voice called from behind, a single phrase sharp as flint, and two men, neighbors whom Ezra had summoned, stood in the doorway. They were there not as rescue but as witness. Ezra spoke of tests of proving devotion, and the men nodded as if to a sermon. Mercy realized in that small sunlight that any concession would be recorded and repurposed. Her act of rebellion was absorbed into Ezra's narrative. She found herself unwillingly grateful for this compassion framed by conviction. That night she wrote in secret, the lines of a tiny confession she kept hidden beneath a floorboard. I tried to let them see morning. The confession was small but dangerous a seed. Mercy began to memorize the basement's rhythms, planning a patient subversion to reclaim sunlight. Soon, as months bled toward a full year, the twins' bodies and minds diverged from the town's expectations. They grew in the pattern of the basement, lit by lamplight and measured by song. Their skin kept a parchment hue, as if the sun were an old book they had not read. Their sleep came in intervals Ezra curated, and their waking hours were tuned to call and response training he had written down in careful ink. Outsiders who craned their ears at the house heard a music that unsettled them. Not childish play or ordinary hymn, but layered intonations that moved like undercurrent. Children on the street refrained from passing the Rutherford gate out of an unnamed caution. Some said superstition, others something more sensible, a moral alarm sounding in their guts. The twins developed habits that dislocated them from ordinary life. They would sit for long spells, palms open, as if reading textures the eye could not perceive. They learned to communicate in a hush, exchanging glances that carried meaning like letters. In the night the house kept a soft pressure, as if expecting something or bracing against some pending strain. Ezra documented everything with growing clinical clarity. He measured pulse rates, recorded responses to songs, tested how long the children sought sound when light was removed. His notes moved between piety and procedure until the distinction disappeared. Mercy found in these pages language that made her stomach twist, diagrams, lists of phases, and a paragraph where Ezra speculated about the necessity of seclusion for preservation of the original. When she read it, she understood the full logic that had seduced him. Remove influence, isolate formation, and you preserve a soul's first shape forever. But in the logic there was brutality. The questions Mercy asked in the small hours, can a person preserve another's soul? Who gives that right? Had no public forum to be answered. Providence's institutions were busy with trade, taxes, and sermons that praised blood and harvest. Nobody was prepared to pry a key from a deacon's pocket. A neighbor's child grew ill after a night near the gate. Prescott worried and pressed Dr. Hamilton, who whispered concern but feared scandal. When Prescott approached a magistrate, Ezra's reputation and charity smoothed official curiosity. Mercy's questions stayed private. In the quiet, the twins continued their schooling, advancing into patterns no one above could decipher. Yet, Providence's harbor sang with commerce that kept its mouth closed about the cost. Ezra's ships, the Mercy, the Providence, and the Salvation, though modestly named, carried more than linens and sugar. They brought stories, tongues, and objects that Ezra used like evidence, fragments of rituals, hymn fragments from other ports, a prayer bead fashioned from a dark seed, a small wooden figure carved in an island dialect. He catalogued these items in a ledger, annotating their supposed purity and repurposing them into his private liturgy. His business partners benefited from his silence and shared his sermons in private rooms. In public they clasped his hand and praised his zeal. This was the alchemy of power, sin commodified, absolution sold in installments. A quiet network grew around Ezra, men who wanted to be cleansed but not to change their business. Institutional manipulation had many faces: charity gifts, negotiated pew placement, and a steady insistence that certain things be kept in order. Even those who raised an eyebrow rarely pressed the issue. Fear of ruining reputations and losing trade silenced them. Meanwhile, the twins learned the contours of darkness and made it their home. Their play involved arranging stones in secret patterns that echoed the sigils Ezra had carved. They sang in a minor way that bent the house's timber toward ritual. Mercy watched these games and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She tried to imagine the future for Samuel and Judith. In her imagination they were lit by sun, learning to read and to choose their own words. In Ezra's imagination, the children's futures were preservation projects, human vessels for an untouched doctrine. Their futures diverged like two paths from the same hill. Around them the town continued to be a busy marketplace of morality and profit, and no lawman wished to arrive with a lantern and a question that would complicate trade. Institutional complicity is never violent in a single sweep. It accumulates in unpaid debts, in turned heads, in polite letters that decline to be blunt. That accumulation had begun to bury Mercy's will, stone by careful stone. Ezra's ledger read like a theology of control. He rationalized withholding as salvation and wrote of slow sanctification. Mercy hid a single page of questions beneath a floorboard. She began to plan not a rebellion but patient record-keeping, preservation of truth for future safety. There came a season when Ezra's experiments shifted from theory into things of consequence. He adjusted diets to be moderate, claiming moderation taught temperance. He extended periods without direct lamplight, arguing that lesser light allowed the inner vision to bloom. Mercy watched as he replaced some foods with plain gruel and insisted on rigid meal hours. The children accepted these changes with the obedience Ezra cultivated. Samuel's laughter thinned into a small, mechanical response that pleased Ezra. Judith's curious reach shortened, her fingers learning the room's contours rather than the world's. In the privacy of the chamber, Ezra introduced an order of nightly devotion that required the twins to lie awake and recite set phrases until their voices matched a metronome of silence. Mercy protested to no effect. She begged doctors for advice about nutrition but found physicians inclined to treat physical ills while accepting marital hierarchies. When she visited Dr. Hamilton, he prescribed tonics and reassurance and advised patience. He did not pry at the philosophical claim that guided Ezra's choices. The basement produced documents that read as theology but functioned as directives: when to dim the lamps, when to enforce stillness, when to read certain passages that trod the line between nurture and erasure. Ezra framed deprivation as sanctification. He convinced himself that he was saving the children from a world of sin. He convinced others by preaching on sacrifice and using his own charity as evidence. Yet the changes took life from the twins in ways that could not be easily marked on a ledger. Their skin grew more translucent, their answers slowed, and they stopped asking to see things by name. Mercy, in secret, kept a list of what they had once known the color of morning. The name of a sparrow, a neighbor's laugh, small facts that she feared would erode entirely. She hid the list beneath cloth and pressed it with iron against her chest. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Each night the house tightened as if expecting a verdict, and every morning Mercy woke with the heavy calculation of how to be kind enough to survive inside and cunning enough to keep a record of what the light had once taught them. A neighbor heard the twins call distant port names in sleep, and Mercy resolved to protect the truth. As seasons turned, The pressure outside the Rutherford house increased in small, legal ways. A servant who had fled to a relative in another town told a story of a locked door and a child who sang in a language not used in Providence. A coachman, annoyed at having his ankle brushed by a small hand, told his employer in indignation, and the tale leaked into cartrooms and alahouses. Goodwife Prescott, finally unmoored by conscience and fear, gathered her notes and the midwife's tools and took the risk of presenting them to a magistrate. She did not storm the meeting house or raise a public cry. She crossed herself and spoke quietly in a magistrate's parlor, laying out the oddities with the care of someone handling a fevered patient. The magistrate listened, fingers steepled, and for a long hour the public and private were measured. Ezra's reputation and gifts were of course mentioned. The ships, the donations, the tears at the pulpit, and they sat heavy on the scales. Yet the magistrate could also see the pattern: a string of neighbors with similar complaints, a midwife's notes, and a servant whose ears had been raw with listening. A warrant could be obtained. The law moves in its own careful pace, and the decision to act required a will unwilling to be softened by charity. In March of a year that felt like any other, the magistrate authorized a search of the basement. A small group, lanterns lit, with keys swearing on their belts, approached the Rutherford door. The town watched. News traveled like a current through taverns and through women's gatherings, gaining volume and a kind of doomed hope. Even those who had once nodded to Ezra at the meeting house felt the gravity of possibility and shivered. The house stood like a crucible awaiting heat. Inside, the nursery's lamps burned with a steady, unnatural patience, as if braced for company or for judgment. The constable's knock hardened into battering. Mercy stood on the stair, shawl clutched, while Ezra met the party with a Bible and please. He argued for time. The magistrate said the law must act. The heavy oak gave with iron, and they descended. Lantern light fell into a room kept from dawn for years, and the town waited, breath held. A thin child's voice answered once, then the house fell silent. The lanterns spilled down into an underworld. Stone walls, once muffling, revealed work alcoves lined with oil lamp cavities, a wooden altar carved in private hands, and shelves filled not with ordinary comforts but with items laid out as offerings. There were small bowls with residue of burned substances, threads tied in knots that matched the sigils in Ezra's journal, and little beds arranged with such care that the room looked more like a chapel for the small than a prison. The most arresting sight was the children. Samuel and Judith lay in their beds, skin pale as parchment, faces soft and strangely kept. Their eyes, when the lantern light hit them, reflected a depth that was not simply blindness, but an adaptation, pupils vast and slow, irises that held a dim gleam like fish who've learned to see in wells. They did not flinch at strangers the way healthy children might. Instead, they studied the intruders with a patient attention that set the searchers uneasy. On a nearby table lay Ezra's journals, careful paint script that moved from scripture to list, from prayer to plan. Pages described methods of isolation with clinical tone. He argued that preserving the original soul required removal from a corrupting sight. He wrote of ceremonies that would, in his mind, bind the child's spirit to a single idea. Those who read felt their throats tighten. The room smelled of lamp oil, old bread, blossoms kept too long. A carved wooden altar bore symbols that matched none of the colony's known churches. It was not wholly foreign. Elements borrowed from distant ports were stitched into forms that read like heresy wearing the face of devotion. The constables and magistrates exchanged looks that mixed horror and the practical need to report. They took inventories, notes that would later be filed away, and for a long, terrible hour the house yielded its small, dark logic. Mercy pressed her hands over her mouth and felt grief so large it made her knees tremble. The children were alive, but the discovery felt less like rescue and more like revelation, proof that zeal could become a machine whose motions spelled death by degrees. A small box held toys, each marked with a sigil. The searchers felt ethical collapse. Some could not meet Mercy's eyes. They recorded items with hands, aware they were documenting a devotion gone lethal. The magistrate and constables faced a question heavier than laws: how to hold a community together after the revelation that one of its most devout had turned sanctity into harm. The decision was not simple. The journals were taken, catalogued, and placed under lock in official custody. Officials debated whether publishing the details would fracture trust in the colony's institutions and commerce. The language used in council was careful and bureaucratic: preservation of public order, protection of the grieving, and the avoidance of scandal that might harm trade. In practice, it meant certain records were sealed, and the explicit theological passages were withheld from public report. For an era, the story was reduced to polite rumor: 2 children found in a basement under the care of an overzealous father, mental breakdown, the weight of grief. But the ledger entries that officials stored away told a sterner truth: meticulous plans, ritual notes, and arguments that justified removal of light as preservation. The colonists, who preferred tidy explanations, accepted a partial truth. Mercy's confession, held in a tiny paper beneath a floorboard, was catalogued as a private deposition and filed under a quiet seal. The house itself acquired a reputation that discouraged long tenancies. Prospective residents found the air cold in certain rooms. New families lasted a fortnight or a month and then left without complaint. They reported the familiar phenomena: child's voice beneath floorboards, lamp smells where no lamp burned, and the sensation of small touches as they crossed thresholds. The house's reputation became a social contagion. Children dared not play by the gate, and the Rutherford name dissolved in polite conversation into a cautionary adjective. Yet the secrecy allowed other mechanisms to continue. Men who traded goods and people kept their accounts balanced. They attended worship, gave alms, and remained untroubled in business practice. The colony could bear this duality only by refusing to read the hidden pages openly. Some families, though, kept private records of what had happened, notes meant to warn descendants, while others drew maps that avoided Benefit Street. Over decades, official silence calcified. The government archived pages and restricted access, hoping absence would muffle the scandal. Yet the story lived in private notebooks and whispered counsel. Some families inscribed warnings in wills, others drew maps to avoid Benefit Street. Generations tried to ignore the Rutherford imprint, to move into the house as if a new family could erase a past. But walls remember fingerprints longer than people remember apologies. Later tenants documented strange, repeatable incidents: voices like children singing beneath floorboards at precisely the hour the siblings had once practiced, lamp smells wafting through walls where no lamp burned, and the often described sensation of small hands brushing an ankle in certain rooms. New owners ripped out carpets expecting rot and found altars beneath, small prayer marks carved into joists, tiny pieces of cloth knotted with the same sigils. They burned some items and hid others, hoping ritual destruction would end the feeling of being watched. No method lasted. Some rooms carried an imponderable coolness, and a tired grief seemed to pool in the chimneys. Tradesmen who worked quickly refused to stay after dark. Houses nearby saw an uptick in sleepless nights, and in the trade of whispered tales exchanged over fences. The Rutherford name became shorthand for a door you did not knock upon. Lawyers and ministers who later rummaged through municipal boxes found white, gloved copies of the journals, censored lines stitched out in bureaucratic hand. Even those censored words had shape. They hinted at justification, at the idea that a life might be preserved by careful erasure of its exposure. The community coexisted with this grief by turning it inward: do charity, keep commerce neat, avoid asking difficult questions out loud. This was the way institutions protect themselves, by folding scandal into the architecture of everyday life. The younger generation treated the house as a story to scare children, a cautionary tale of zeal. But some elders kept grim notes, private admonitions written in the margins of family Bibles. In that way the truth passed, not in proclamations, but in small failures to forget and in the quiet practice of closing shutters. The house did not change quickly. It settled into its role as a bone in the town's mouth. Morsel of memory picked it carefully by those who preferred comfortable ignorance. As decades folded into a century, a historian petitioned for the sealed files, arguing public interest. Officials resisted. When fragments later surfaced, they were redacted and partial, leaving fewer answers than hopes. The mystery hardened into a moral the town told at hearthside. Prosperity and purity seldom coexist, and the house kept its watch. To speak of the twins' interior life is to enter speculation, but the artifacts left behind suggested a curriculum of perception rather than ordinary education. Ezra's notes describe exercises to train the eye away from worldliness and teach a child to read texture rather than horizon. The sigils carved into joists borrowed geometric patterns from distant coasts, warped into cruciforms that read as syncretic iconography, pieces of other people's faith stitched into a new, intense devotion. This fusion hints at a broader truth about forbidden knowledge. It is often a hybrid, stitched from aesthetic pieces taken from many sources and reassembled into a doctrine that suits one man's hunger. The twins, raised in that braided belief, may have achieved forms of perception others call uncanny, and those who study control call adaptive. Samuel's sense of rhythm mapped the house like a navigator, and Judith's fingers learned to name the plane of a rug and the voice that used it. Their inner languages, partially written in Ezra's journals, show a fascination with continuity, with keeping something unchanged. The mechanism of control Ezra built combined psychological constraints with what he believed were metaphysical safeguards. He taught the twins to value absence as a virtue, absence of sight, absence of distraction, absence of worldly claims. This is what made his practice so pernicious. When one convinces another that lack is holiness, the lack becomes a prison and a virtue both. There is an ugliness in the institutionalization of this thought. A community that prizes purity without admitting the price will produce zealots who measure souls like crop yields. Yet even as we condemn Ezra's methods, it is worth noting the tragic sincerity with which he acted. His notes are not merely the handwriting of a monster, but the pleading of a man convinced he can outmaneuver corruption. That tragic conviction is a common vector for harm. It is the fuel that allows cruelty to dress itself in piety. The basement, then, reads as a place where an ideology met an experimental program and where two children who had no say in either were molded into living arguments for an idea. The larger pattern matters: religious certainty, lucrative commerce, and legal hesitance braided to permit harm. Communities that prize outward purity and economic stability more than ethical reckoning will always produce hidden experiments in the name of salvation. Sadly, as centuries passed, the Rutherford story dispersed into multiple forms: a redacted file in a municipal chest, a rumor told at funerals, a sensational paragraph in a pamphlet, and a whispered lure for curiosity seekers. Historians found fragments and argued over provenance. Folklorists noted how the tale flexed to meet the anxieties of each generation. Psychologists, in their modern garments, looked at the case as an example of extreme behavioral conditioning, a study in how authority reshapes an infant's world. Paranormal hunters staked out the porch in later years, lanterns and spirits swirled by handheld cameras, each click of a recorder promising to prove what the town preferred to keep mythic. The various retellings often missed the central cruelty, the slow, domestic apparatus of conviction Ezra assembled with charity and scripture. The more sensational accounts emphasized ghosts or curses, the more scholarly ones emphasized structures of power. Both approaches contain truth. Both also obscure the human cost by turning people into symbols. Some descendants of the town's elite still find the Rutherford files inconvenient. They prefer to emphasize the era's charitable works and to suggest a single rotten episode cannot indict a city's entire moral project. Others, whose ancestors kept quiet, began to speak up in restrained tones, citing the importance of reckoning with legacy. In modern archives, a few pages remain tightly redacted, words scratched out with formal stamps promising closure. Yet the omissions invite interpretation. People will always make narratives from gaps. The way communities choose to frame the past, as mistake, exception, or system, determines whether they learn from it or merely repeat it. For Providence, the Rutherford basement became a mirror. Those who looked away could continue business as usual. Those who looked close found a reflection that asked them to name their own complicities. The story refuses simple closure. Its end is a question pressed into a book's margin. Today, the story is taught as a lesson in institutional failure. Scholars use it to show how ritual without accountability becomes domination. Activists cite it when pushing transparency. Elders repeat it as a warning. The Rutherford house remains a case study in suppression, how legal silence, social deference, and comfort with moral contradictions produce conditions where harm can hide behind piety. The tale is not merely history. It is a manual on how power masks itself as virtue for present and future. The immediate aftermath strained the town's moral imagination. The magistrate ordered the children removed from the basement and placed in external care. For a brief moment Mercy tasted a fragile relief, an opening like breathable air. But the years spent without reliable sunlight, without ordinary social stimuli, had already altered their physiology and their attachment. Physicians of the era could mend wounds and prescribe herbs, but they were unfamiliar with treating a mind taught to calibrate in darkness. Samuel and Judith needed not only food and warmth, but reintroduction to a world in which eyes learn color and hands learn names. Care was provided, and the townspeople performed what rituals they could. Gifts were brought, prayers offered, and novices attempted therapies that mixed medicine and patience. The children improved in small ways. A new appetite, a smile that creased a cheek. But their early formation had been cut and stitched into a new pattern. Mercy spent every hour with them, reciting the names of things she feared would vanish: sparrow, harbor, sun, Lenin. She taught them to listen for the sound of the river beyond the harbor and to name its color. Yet some effects proved stubborn. The children had internalized a logic of absence. They relied on the contours of the basement for security. Even under sunlight, their attention would return to patterns invisible to others, to the cadence of cellars and the soft music of hidden lamps. Years after removal, when a chronic weakness smote Samuel in a winter of poor harvest, and Judith's lungs grew brittle from exposure and stress, the town felt its old failures wash like cold rain. The twins' decline was not an accusation but a consequence. The slow erosion of possibilities was a history written in small losses rather than a single violent act. When Samuel and Judith died within months of each other, the official records recorded causes with the neutrality of clerks: consumption, debility. But the families who loved them knew the arithmetic of deprivation. Years of ritualized isolation had narrowed the space in which their lives could grow. The public reaction was messy. Officials feared scandal. The colonial government sealed sensitive records for decades. Ezra was removed from office and privately disgraced, but public emphasis favored closure over full truth. Communities preferred explanations that allowed commerce and reputations to remain undisturbed afterward. As always, after the twins' deaths, the Rutherford house changed hands more times than would seem sensible. 3 generations of families tried to live there and none lasted long. They left with hurried trunks and words like unbearable or too many memories that replaced more specific accounts. Real estate adverts would list staircases and fireplaces and omit the history. Those who ignored the omission found themselves at the gates staring at cold panes. The house developed patterns that made new inhabitants uneasy: small noises like children's breath beneath floorboards, the faint smell of lamp oil in rooms where no lamp burned, and that pressure along the walls that made the hair on the neck stand up. These phenomena are often described in language of hauntings, but consider a different framing. Institutional failure becomes material. When communities fail to name harm, it hardens into architecture. Silence penetrates plaster like mold. The Rutherford case is a textbook example of how psychological control systems can be set into place by a single individual and then maintained, not only by direct caution, but by the acquiescence of commerce and law. Ezra's creation was not merely a personal monstrosity, but an instance of an idea that metastasized purity as a policy, restraint as governance. Atrocities often begin with a moral intensity justified by rhetoric, and the structures of business and worship create alliance points that obscure boundaries. In the house's slow afterlife, the architecture of denial persisted because people found it easier to maintain convenience than to overhaul conscience. Yet the story also includes small resistances, hidden notes, a midwife's private ledger, a neighbor's diary entry, Mercy's own page of questions secreted under floorboard. These fragments became counter-archives, the only shadow history insisting on a fuller account. They remind us that forbidden history is not only in the sealed chest of state, but in the quiet margins where ordinary people record what they cannot say aloud. The legacy lingers because some did not look away. Modern scholars pass the Rutherford files to warn institutions about untethered authority. They show how economic interest can shield moral accountability and how systems adapt to defend the status quo. The case demonstrates that suppressed truths often resurface and that transparency matters. It especially shows how one person's sincere obsession can become communal harm when action is withheld. It urges communities to remember that mercy without oversight risks becoming institutional cruelty. Ezra's charisma was a weapon disguised as pastoral care. He had the voice and the patience to recast guilt as duty and to frame restriction as preservation. This rhetorical skill allowed him to create a moral economy in which small austerities felt like virtue and obedience read as salvation. Psychological control often relies on such reframing. The person in authority shapes language, naming an action wholly to neutralize dissent. Ezra's tools were simple and effective. Language, ritual, schedules, and ritual objects that gave visible form to invisible rules. Once community norms bent toward his vocabulary, resistance became difficult. Charity bound merchants to him with gratitude. Pew placement bound elders with social obligation. Legal instruments like property and contract offered structural cover. Those who might have acted instead found themselves hamstrung by deference and self-interest. The midwife, Prescott, knew the truth, but feared legal peril. Neighbors feared social fallout. This is how suppressed truths calcify. Small decisions to look away multiply and become institutional habits. Yet the record also shows pockets of refusal. Mercy's hidden page survived because someone chose to hide it rather than burn it. A servant's whispered confession lodged in another town's tavern ledger rather than vanishing into rumor. These fragments made later truth tellers possible. The dynamics reveal a persistent lesson. Systems that do not design for accountability will always produce pathological outcomes when charismatic actors exploit social blind spots. Institutions can be designed to resist such capture. Transparent ledgers, independent oversight, and a culture that encourages questioning rather than mere performative piety. But design requires will, and will needs pressure. The Rutherford case shows what happens when that pressure is absent. In the quiet aftermath, a community that kept its markets open but closed its eyes paid a cultural price measured in private grief and eroded trust. Consider concrete safeguards. Empowered midwives, required disclosures for charity donors, independent religious oversight panels, legal protections for whistleblowers, civic education urging questioning of authority, rotation of community leaders. If such mechanisms existed, Ezra's actions might have been checked early. Instead, the community prioritized comfort and commerce, tolerating a charisma that matched convenience. Institutional corruption is often mundane policies that favor reputation over accountability, incentives that reward silence. The Rutherford case warns without structural checks. Pious language becomes a cover for control, and ritual becomes a technology of harm that outlives its inventor, and so history repeats itself. There are two ways to read the more uncanny claims about the Rutherford basement. One reads them as cultural artifacts, voices and syllables borrowed from ports, a language grafted from sailors, a ritual vocabulary assembled from objects that crossed the Atlantic. The other reads them as signs of something that slipped the bounds of ordinary parish life, a pattern of behavior so intense and repetitive that it produced emergent phenomena at the edges of psychology. Both readings matter. The first points to tangible facts. Sailors spoke other tongues, objects carry meanings, and Ezra had access to a network of trade that brought foreign liturgies into a city that preferred its particular brand of faith. The second points to the physics of conditioning. Repeated sensory deprivation, pattern sound, and authoritative narration can create unanticipated cognitive states. In such states, children may invent private grammars or tune into cues adults miss. Scholars who study extremities of socialization show how intense regimes produce novel capacities and pathologies alike. Whether the twins' singing was an echo of other cultures or a product of intense conditioning, the result was the same: a language that belonged to the basement and could not be fully translated by ordinary ears. That privacy made it a perfect vehicle for sacristy. When a practice cannot be heard, its moral implications can be denied. The unfathomable becomes a convenient cloak. This is a deeper lesson about forbidden knowledge. Secrecy preserves power. When knowledge is withheld, it accrues authority. People then mistake the hidden for the holy. Ezra's house demonstrates this plainly. The very act of keeping a practice in the dark created an epistemic advantage for those who ran it, and a moral hazard for everyone else. In the end, whether one calls the twins' songs foreign or emergent, The ethical demand is the same. Transparency and accountability should cut like a lantern through the closets of power. This pattern repeats, forbidden rights recycled as innovation while institutions reward secrecy. Ancient corruption is not just old relics, it's an active practice of borrowing legitimacy to shelter abuse. A carved symbol or foreign song becomes sacred when a social order refuses scrutiny. The Rutherford tale demands historical curiosity without sensationalism and moral courage to create systems that reject silence as virtue, enforce transparency, and protect the vulnerable from charisma dressed in piety. This response requires pressure and institutional reform. Over the long term, the Rutherford story did what many suppressed histories do. It braided itself into the civic memory, appearing in cautionary tales, academic footnotes, and the private grief of families. The small paper mercy hid under a floorboard became a seed of truth when a sympathetic clerk found it in an estate inventory a generation later. That single page resonated more than official records because it contained tenderness and doubt where the public files had contained procedures and euphemisms. Historians later found the page poignant because it was human and unsystematic, a messy counterpoint to Ezra's neat manuals. Over time, scholars pieced fragments together: Ezra's imports, the ship manifests, the archival redactions, and the social networks that had enabled both commerce and concealment. They mapped a picture of how private piety and public profit can graft onto each other, creating protective scaffolding around abusive practice. Local churches revised their oversight structures. Midwifery and medical guilds argued for clearer reporting obligations. Charitable boards adopted transparency measures. These reforms did not erase the past, but they aimed to prevent repetition. Meanwhile, the house itself stood as a paradox, an architectural wound that attracted curiosity and repelled comfort. A few brave residents attempted restorations to dilute the atmosphere. Others preserved a portion as a memorial to the lost twins. Tourists sometimes came seeking the scandal. Students and teachers came seeking caution. The narrative resisted being flattened into a single moral. It is not merely a story of individual evil or institutional failure. It is a layered lesson about human hunger for control, about the ways charisma can dress as holiness, and about how communities negotiate shame and profit. The Rutherford basement teaches that truth will seep, even through stone. Those who push to expose it are doing more than satisfying curiosity. They are restoring agency to those whose voices were once hidden beneath floorboards. The ethical demand is simple: transparency, protections for whistleblowers, and a civic culture that prizes truth over reputation. Remember Mercy's page: ordinary courage to keep memory alive. Reckoning with Rutherford means practicing civic habits. Ask uncomfortable questions, support oversight, refuse to let reputations eclipse accountability. If communities choose accountability over comfort, they shrink the space for private experiments conducted in the name of salvation. The work is mundane: open records, audited gifts, rotated leaders, and listening neighbors, and protect the vulnerable among us from future harm. Listen now as a last, slow lesson settles over this tale. You came for dark history, and what you heard was not only shocking detail but a map. The Rutherford house is a microcosm of how human systems can transmute mercy into machinery. Here are 3 things to carry with you. First, the presence of silence is not proof of purity. Often the things people do not say are the very things that require the most scrutiny. Second, be vigilant of charisma when it is paired with convenience. When leaders give comfort to those who profit, the chances of concealed harm rise. Third, honor the small acts of memory: a midwife's note, a hidden page, a neighbor's diary, because these fragments are the scaffolding of truth. Do not confuse ritual for righteousness. Ritual absent accountability can be a technology of control. If you want society to be safer, focus less on dramatic reforms and more on mundane practices. Insist on transparent ledgers. Protect those who report abuse. Rotate authority so power does not calcify, and teach communities to listen as rigorously as they judge. These things are not glamorous, but they are effective. Mercy's quiet courage should instruct your actions more than Ezra's eloquence instructs your fears. Remember that justice is often less a single verdict than a long tending. If you carry one image from this story, let it be Mercy's page pressed under a floorboard. A fragile, stubborn thing that survived silence. Let that page be a symbol of witness, not spectacle. Take this story into the small places you control: a meeting, a donation, a conversation. Ask who benefits from secrecy. Ask who is silenced. Refuse to accept that reputation alone should shield wrong. The world is made of small choices. The Rutherford basement did what it did because many small choices stacked until they became a tower. Dismantle towers before they stand. If this story changed you, tell someone the truth in a way that creates accountability, not gossip. You are not merely an observer of history, you are a custodian of future moral practice. Carry that responsibility with quiet courage, and the shadows will be harder to hide in. Wake others without dramatizing. Offer structures, not rumors. Share mercy's lesson with those who can act: teachers, counselors, donors, and clergy. Build systems that make silence impossible. Begin with courage.